Welcome everyone to another episode of our Systems, Neuroscience and Complexity seminar. I'm really excited today to have an ex-supervisor and mentor of mine and collaborator, Russ Poldrack. So Russ is coming to us from the West Coast of the United States. Russ has a really amazing and diverse sort of background in cognitive neuroscience and an open reproducible science that I'm not going to be able to summarize properly here. But I might start by saying that when I reached out to Russ to give a presentation for our seminar, he wrote back and said he'd be happy to give a talk, but that he doesn't do either systems neuroscience or complexity. And I had to have a chuckle because the reason that I really wanted Russ to come along, and I thought it would be a really great person to have present to us, is that a lot of the people in our group and in our sort of wider community don't really have a sort of strong background in things like cognitive neuroscience and the kinds of conceptual terms that are irreducibly linked with the kinds of measurements that we're creating when we analyze brain imaging data. And so you might hear terms like working memory or attention or other concepts like that, reinforcement learning, all these ideas kind of floating around, and it's very hard to kind of parse between them. So as someone who's done a lot of cognitive neuroscience experiments, I still find it challenging at times to really tell what someone means by a particular term. And so in just one part of Russ's work, he's gone after trying to help clarify that space of what we would call cognitive ontologies. What are the kind of rules that we need to put together for the terms that we use? And I thought it'd be really cool to kind of have that overview for everyone to kind of get some of those ideas of concepts, what we can do to start to then take these brain imaging measures that we're creating with dimensionality direction, with information theory, with HCTSA, and to put them into context of this kind of broader scheme of cognitive neuroscience. So Russ, thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to hear your talk and take it away when you're ready.
All right, thank you. Let me get my slides up. All right, does that look good? All right, so thanks for having me. Thanks for getting up relatively early to hear me talk. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about what we call an ontology of cognition and what it should look like. So different people use this word ontology in different ways. If you've taken a philosophy class, you would encounter it in a concept of metaphysics, which is like, what really exists, right? Ontology is like the stuff, like what really exists. But there's a whole other way to think about ontology that, is really, you can think of it as sort of like cognitive psychology or as, more like computer science or informatics, which is really, basically, what is it that people think exists? So the famous definition from Gruber from computer science is an ontology is a specification of a conceptualization. So you take what people think and you write it down in a formal way. How do scientists actually try to reduce the complexity of the world? And so I'm going to ask, like, what do we want from a cognitive ontology? The ontology that describes like the things that are in our minds, not in our brains, but in our minds. So, one of the ways you might think about what we want from this is, on the one side, we've got things that we know about, like neurons and neurotransmitters and brain networks, things like that. On the other side, we have things like behavior, like people perform in particular systematically structured ways on psychological tasks. People get psychological disorders, that are at least somewhat consistent across people, like depression. And so we want to know, like, what's in between those? How do you get from like what neurons are doing to what the ways that people behave and talk and think? So that's what an ontology would give us. And now the question is, like, why does it need to be a formal ontology? Why does it help to kind of write it down in a systematic way? And one way to think of this is, that in some ways cognitive ontology is sort of the units of cognitive ontology are the components of psychological theory. So if you look in the psychological literature, often theories are expressed in ways that sort of look like what I'm showing you here, right? So a theory of working memory would have like central executive processes and focus of attention, blah, blah, blah. A theory of reading might have, you go from written words to graphemes to input orthographic lexicons and so on. So these are all supposed to be sort of parts of what the mind are doing, right? And that psychologists have sort of coined as sort of components of their theories. And these we then usually take from cognitive psychology, and they become sort of like the vocabulary of functional organization of the brain. If we want to ask, like, what does a particular piece of brain or a particular brain network or a particular set of neurons in a particular part of the brain, what are they doing in terms of cognitive function? And so our ontology becomes like, we say this area is involved in, for example, in the language model from Hickok and Popple, like the mid-post superior temporal sulcus is involved in phonological processing. The dorsal superior temporal gyrus is involved in spectrotemporal analysis, and so on. So those are the functions that we ascribe to particular units of organization in the brain. We also think that they're probably the breakpoints in mental health disorders. And certainly this is, in recent years, at least within the US, there's been a move towards thinking about the basis of mental illness as being kind of related to a set of different dimensions of psychological function that might be, things like negative or positive valence, cognitive functions like working memory and all of its different parts, arousal, and so on. So again, the cognitive ontology, things like active maintenance or flexible updating or response selection and so on, those are thought to be the potential breakpoints in mental health disorders. And finally, you can also think about a cognitive ontology in a much kind of less highfalutin sort of way, as we would say where I come from in Texas, which is ontology is sort of a way to annotate data, right? To basically say, for this particular data set, we think it's about X and not Y. We think that this is, a particular task, like one of the data sets that might be in our open neuro database. It might be about working memory and not about long-term memory and so on. So it provides us basically a set of tags, if you will, to assign to particular data sets. So when we started thinking about this more than a decade ago, we realized that there really was no place one could go to like even see, written down what are all the parts of the mind. And so we developed this project that we call the Cognitive Atlas. It's still available at cognitiveatlas.org. That's meant to be basically sort of like, Wikipedia for cognitive science in a very structured sort of way. The idea is that we try to figure out, what are the ways that we want to chop up the kinds of concepts and terms that cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists use, and then sort of flesh those out in as detailed a way as we can. And the motivation and the sort of inspiration here came in large part from a lot of work that had been done previously in bioinformatics around the development of biomedical ontologies. And the best known one that some of you may have heard of is this thing called the gene ontology, where basically a bunch of people got together and wrote down what are all the concepts that people in biology use. And those are split out into biological processes, things like, MAPK kinase, which is a kind of intracellular transduction. And so these relationships like kind of and part of, those are the fundamental sort of ontological relationships that make up these types of knowledge. And then you have different molecular functions, you have different cellular components. So the idea is, people came up with about 40,000 different terms that you might use and definitions of them and how they relate to one another that have really, in some ways revolutionized the way that people do biology, because now you have data sets that can be tagged with those things, you can search for them and so on. And it's enabled a really broad set of analyses that wouldn't be possible without that knowledge. So when we thought about what this should look like for cognition, the first thing that we wanted to do was separate out what we call mental concepts, which are the kind of latent things that we think happen in the mind, and the mental tasks that are used to measure them. And so one of the things that often happens, especially in cognitive neuroscience, is people will refer to tasks in terms of the concepts that they think are being measured. They'll say, this is a working memory task, right? But that task working memory is far from the only thing that's involved in that task, and different aspects of the task may or may not rely on working memory. So we try to be very careful about distinguishing between the psychological constructs, the mental concepts on one side, like response suppression or working memory updating, and the tasks that are used to measure them. And in particular, the measurements, what we call the contrast, the measurements that are used to index those things. So we specify this particular relationship called the measured by relationship, which basically tells you what variables on particular tasks do we think measure or index the function of that particular mental concept. Now, I didn't actually know about Paul Meehl when I started working on this stuff a long time ago, but it turns out that what we were doing bears a really close relationship to ideas that he had talked about, half a century before then, in terms of what he and Cronbach called the nomological network, which is really, meant to describe as he said, the observable properties and quantities and relate those to each other, or the theoretical constructs, relating those to observable things, or relating different theoretical constructs to one another. That's basically just what we've done here. It just took us, 50 something years to put it onto a website, basically. But the point is that in cognitive science, this hadn't really been done. Like nobody had sort of even tried to lay out this sort of systematic framework for describing all of these things. So if you go to cognitiveatlas.org, you'll see something like this, and let's say you search for working memory, you'll find a bunch of different concepts, some of which say working memory in them, others of which are related. Let's just click into working memory. And then it will have some information like a definition. And in particular, you have all these different relationships, right? Working memory is a kind of memory, it's a kind of cognitive control. Spatial working memory is a kind of working memory. So you have this tree structure, this hierarchical structure with these different types of either kind of or part of relationships, sort of ontological relationships between things. That you can then use if you want to, try to be more specific about what it is that you're actually talking about. And we relate back to particular tasks. So for example, we might say on the complex span task, the measure of sequence length is a variable that relates directly to working memory function. And we have a bunch of information about those particular tasks, like what is it that they measure, implementations, and so on. We also try to describe sort of higher level sets of things, either ones that we call theories, which are basically like those sets of claims, or task batteries, which are basically sets of tasks that people use together. So for example, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is a battery that has a bunch of constituent tasks. It has various derived indicators like full scale IQ and so on. Or if you go to, look at what do we say about Baddeley's model of working memory? Well, here's a kind of a word description that we just stole from Wikipedia, but then there's a bunch of assertions that theory makes, right? These are basically propositions that are part of the claims of that theory. Like there's a thing called the episodic buffer that's part of working memory. There's a thing called the phonological loop, which is a kind of a rehearsal loop, and so on. And those are particular things that theory would claim to be true. Other theories may or may not believe that those things are true. Other theories might not even believe that, for example, phonological loop is a thing, right? That it doesn't even, it shouldn't even be part of the ontology. This is one of the big challenges here, right? Is that in biology, at least for the most part, most people believe that, like the endoplasmic reticulum is part of a cell, right? For almost any construct in psychology, you can probably find somebody who doesn't even believe that construct actually exists, that it names a real thing. So, this is a project that's kind of simmered, as I said, for more than 10 years, and, sort of gains interest occasionally, but it's really been a challenging project in part because, we haven't had a proof of concept for its utility. And so it's been hard to convince researchers that it's worth paying attention to. So, a few labs have sort of contributed to it, but it's really been hard to grab people. And then the other challenge is that, and I think part of the reason why people may not, want to get involved is that there's a lot of disagreement. So if somebody doesn't believe that working memory exists and they come to the Cognitive Atlas and they see, oh, hey, it says working memory is this thing, that might just, sort of put them off. And so a lot of the constructs and the relationships are controversial. So that's a completely top-down process, right? And so there's a number of reasons to think that doing this top down may not be the best way to go about it. And so we, a few years ago, started thinking about, can we imagine learning a new ontology directly from data? So I'm going to tell you now about a project that that we did that tried to see what this might look like. That was really driven by a grad student in my lab, Ian Eisenberg, along with Patrick Bissett, who's a research scientist in the lab. And it's sort of, there's an underlying tension in psychology. I grew up as a cognitive psychologist where the idea is like if you want to know how the mind works, you go and do experiments. You manipulate something and you see how it changes people's behavior. But there's long been this other tradition in psychology that Lee Cronbach, he wrote this paper in 1957. He called the correlators, which are the correlational method, which are basically people who just go look at what's correlated with what and try to understand, try to infer from that, induce from that, what's the structure that's in the data. So we focused on a particular research domain in this study, which is the domain of what we call self-regulation, or you might call self-control, which is something that's studied across nearly every area of psychology using a really broad range of methods. So some of the ways that that's studied, like one thing, this is something that schematic on the top right of something that we've used a bunch, which is called a stop signal task, where I show you a stimulus and then I occasionally tell you, oh, hey, don't respond to that stimulus. And I look at how long it takes you, I estimate how long it takes you to stop your behavior. Other people might look at, making choices over time, what's often called delay discounting. It's like, would you take $17.11 today versus $25.66 in 2 weeks? Give you a bunch of those choices and I can infer how patient you are. That's thought to be an aspect of self-regulation. Can also just ask you questions, rate yourself on these things like I plan tasks carefully, I make up my mind quickly, I plan trips well ahead of time, things like that. So there's all these different things are talked about as measuring this thing that people refer to as self-control or self-regulation, even though they really couldn't be more different as measurements. And so people before us have tried to do sort of, data-driven analyses to try to ask about the structure of self-regulation. This is probably the best known one, which comes from Miyake and Friedman, who use data from a number of different tasks and use sort of standard sort of multivariate analysis approaches from psychology, like factor analysis, to ask, what the structure is that underlies performance on a bunch of these different tasks. And they've generally argued that, well, there's several different components, one that has to do with working memory updating, one that has to do with kind of shifting or attention, one that has to do with inhibition. But that's still, even though they looked at, say, 9 different measures, that's really nowhere near that whole breadth of measures that people use across science, psychological science. So we decided to try to do a really big battery on a decent number of people to try to assess, what happens when you give people measures that really sort of span this entire range. So we came up with 37 cognitive tasks, tasks where we're measuring accuracy and reaction time and behavior, 23 surveys that people use, questionnaires that they would use to assess things like impulsivity or risk-taking or sensation-seeking, things like that are thought to relate to self-control. We also had surveys about what we call real-world outcomes that people think relate to self-control, like, how much money do you have in your bank account? Do you own a house? How many traffic tickets have you gotten in the last year? Do you smoke? How do you do drugs? Things like that. So we got a little over 500 people to complete this battery, which in total took about 10 hours. And we developed some infrastructure to allow them to basically come back and kind of do it at their own pace. And so most people took, about a week to a week and a half to finish the 10-hour battery. So this is kind of jumping straight to the chase. So there's a bunch of variables we get off of all those different tasks and the surveys. And I'm separating out tasks and surveys for a reason that becomes really important, which is that they have almost no relationship with one another. These are all things that are supposed to be measuring self-regulation, self-control, cognitive control, one of those sort of related constructs. But here what we did was we just took all of the variables across all of the measures, DVs, just dependent variables. We computed their absolute correlation. We thresholded and used randomization to get at family-wise error. and then basically just visualize those as a network diagram. And so the colors here reflect I don't know, I'm colorblind, what is that, like pink? That reflects task variables. The blue reflects survey variables. And you see there's clearly two separate communities here, one composed of survey variables, one composed of task variables. And within tasks, about 10% of all relationships were significant. Within surveys, about 39% of all relationships were significant. Between them, only 0.2% of all possible associations. So there's really very few relationships between survey variables and task variables. And so what this suggests to us is this construct that people in psychology use, self-regulation, is really not a coherent psychological construct, at least across the broad set of domains where it's applied. So we can also look within domains. So for example, actually, let me tell you how we do that. So we, again, factor analysis is a really common approach that's used in psychology to ask this question about what's the structure, what are the latent variables that underlie, some set of observed variables. And so we used sort of standard exploratory factor analysis methods, and then used model selection to pick the problem is you don't know the number of latent variables, the dimensionality of the model. You have to estimate that, and we use BIC. And so we basically put in all of our measures, we get out these different factors, and then for each individual we also get a score for each of those factors, and then we can use those to do analyses. This is basically what this is showing you is we chose 12 factors for the survey data and 5 factors for the task data because those had minimum BIC, but you can see that there's a big kind of swath of things here that we could have. There's not that big of a difference in the fit of the model. Clearly you need at least about 6 for the surveys and probably at least 5 for the task, but then you can break things up finer, but it doesn't really do anything for you. Now, one of the things that's often done in factor analysis is that people will, find the factors and then interpret the factors based on, what particular individual variables load heavily on those factors, which is, if you think about it, sort of a funny way to go about it, because it's really characterizing the dimensions rather than the structure within the multidimensional space. And so we took an approach that's very similar to something that was done by Luis Núñez-Amaral and his colleagues recently in the personality domain, which is instead of looking at the underlying factors and saying, what are the things that sort of load on the factors, we basically treated the factors as, the basis set across which all of our concepts are defined, and then clustered within that factor space to ask what things move together. And it turns out that clustering within that factor space gives us much cleaner structure than clustering on the raw measures. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm happy to say more. So here are the, let me just kind of walk you through what we have here. So each of these 5 rows is basically a color-coded representation of the factor loadings for each of the particular tasks. Each column in this graph is one of the tasks that we used, and I don't label them here because it would be too tiny for you to see. But what we do is we've given sort of names to the 5 factors based on what loads on them. One we call speeded information processing, which really has to do with sort of how quickly you process information. I should say that all the reaction time measures here were analyzed when it was appropriate using a drift diffusion model, which basically sort of takes the data from the space of reaction time and accuracy and puts it into what you might think of as a more understandable latent space in which you describe behavior in terms of what we call a drift rate, which is how quickly are you accumulating information, threshold, which is basically how cautious are you, and then what we call a non-decision time, which is how much time do you need to kind of process information outside of actually making the decision. And it turns out that those three variables are, across lots of different tasks, they correlate with one another. And look at you get this regardless of which of several methods we use to fit the drift diffusion model. So the idea is that you have a bunch of different tasks that are moving together, not in terms of concepts that we often think of as being the ones that are relevant, like inhibition or working memory or task switching, but really moving together in terms of some sort of broader constructs that aren't often discussed in this literature of self-regulation. Things like caution and conflict. Sometimes, conflict processing is something that people talk about there, so that's certainly one where it's relevant. But things like, inhibition-related thresholds or model-based decision-making or model-free decision-making. And so, what this highlights is the degree to which, when you look at the data from the bottom up, you get some overlap of constructs, but you also get a number of different constructs that aren't necessarily sort of discussed in that literature, but that may well be relevant to understanding the domain. And they're very different from the constructs that pop out when you look at the survey measures. So here we had a larger number of factors, but here you see that, whereas here there was a lot of, or at least some degree of overlap such that, a lot of tasks would have sort of loadings on multiple factors. Here you see it's pretty kind of, each factor pretty much captures one. Like there's a sensation seeking factor, there's a sensation seeking cluster, there's a risk perception factor, which mostly is loaded on by the risk perception cluster. So the point here is that there's a bunch of these constructs that don't really overlap at all with the constructs that came out on the task analysis. Suggesting that this is another way to think about sort of inferring what's the structure across all the different ways that we measure things that we then want to go map onto the brain. I'm going to skip over that. So obviously there's challenges for data-driven ontology as well. And I think the fundamental challenge, which many of you are probably familiar with, is that there's no unique solution to the problem. And it's sort of a general problem with clustering or unsupervised learning, I think laid out really nicely in this paper by von Luxemburg and colleagues from 2012. This is a quote: "The difficulty with unsupervised clustering is that there are a huge number of possibilities regarding what would be done with it, and as yet no abstraction akin to a loss function which distills the end user intent. Depending on the use to which a clustering is to be put, the same clustering can be either helpful or useless." That is what I see as the fundamental challenge here, is how do we, once we're in data-driven land, in some ways, there's really no limits on what we can do. And I mean that in a bad way, not in a good way. So, this becomes clear in factor analysis, where there's no unique best factor solution in terms of model fit, right? We can rotate the factor structure and get the goodness of fit to the data is exactly the same. We have to do model selection. We do that using heuristics, right? It's not as if BIC is the right way to do it as opposed to AIC or cross-validation or anything else. And there's no best clustering solution. So, one of the ways that I like to think about it is sort of from what we're trying to do from a measurement perspective. In some ways, this goes back, to what Paul Meehl was talking about long ago in terms of, what people in psychology often refer to as construct validity. The idea is that, how well does a particular measure index a particular latent construct? And there are lots of strategies in psychology for trying to assess this that in general haven't been used by people in cognitive psychology. They're often used by people who develop surveys and things like that. They're not usually used by people like me. This is stuff that I didn't learn in grad school. I learned in the last few years, because it's clear that it's relevant to what we're doing, but it isn't the way that a lot of people in our field think. So we can, what we can think about as ontology developers is really sort of how empirically coherent is a particular construct. And ultimately, I think that one of the hopes is we can sort of start using ontologies to actually or start using data to actually test ontology. So here's an example of what that might look like. So let's say I have data on 4 different tasks. It can be behavioral data. In this case, it's brain data. And one person has a model. Their ontology says, these two tasks measure this particular construct of inhibition. These two tasks measure this particular construct of updating. And there's somebody else who says, no, there's just a single function that's measured by all of those things, right? Now we can actually ask, which, using approaches that I don't have time to talk about here today, but would happy to say a bit more about, using models that we've been working on to actually predict brain activity from task annotations like the ones that we have in the cognitive atlas. We can ask which of these models actually better predicts brain activity in an out of sample way, and start to actually test these underlying theories of the structure of the mind. Okay, so I want to turn now to asking, what do we think the language in which a cognitive ontology should be written is? So as you've seen, as I've already shown you, the cognitive ontology is currently written in human natural language, right? We talk about things like working memory and response inhibition and stuff like that. These are sort of human natural language concepts that we apply to to developing tasks and ultimately measuring them. But in a lot of other domains, the development of new scientific methods and approaches has given us fundamentally new ontologies. And I think this is a really nice example from brain cancer. So prior to 1900, a brain tumor was called a brain tumor because it was a tumor that was located in the brain and not in the liver. That was the defining feature of it, is sort of what its physical location was. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and anatomists started to realize there's different types of brain tumors. There's oligodendrocytomas, there's glioblastoma multiformes, there's all these other types. They're defined now based on their microscopic anatomy, right? So there you already had a different ontology, which was basically saying, well, you have to care about what the cells are. Fast forward to today, and you have a completely different ontology of brain tumors. Obviously, people still, when you talk to a patient with one, you refer to it as a brain tumor. But when you're characterizing the brain tumor, you describe it in terms of its molecular biology, right? It turns out that glioblastoma multiforme is actually 3 different types of tumor, at least, that have different mutations, different patterns of gene expression, different prognosis. They're thought to, sort of support different types of best treatment approaches. But the important thing is this new ontology is written in the language of molecular biology, right? It's written in NCAM1 and NDRG2 and DLL3 and those sorts of things, right? So it's a fundamentally different way of talking about things. And the question is, what would this look like for us in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience? And I think that the best clues come from the fact that within cognitive science in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a computational turn such that the best theories, at least in large parts of cognitive psychology, are computational theories. And there's a broad range of what those theories might look like, right? There's theories, for example, this is, Jess Hamrick and others have done work on these, kind of Bayesian models of physical reasoning. Noah Goodman and Mike Frank have Bayesian models of communicative intent, sort of how do people decide, how do they interpret what other people are saying? I already mentioned the drift diffusion model. This is a much simpler sort of model that basically just decomposes reaction times into a set of latent features. Michael Frank has, some of these models are really sort of more biologically inspired. So, Michael J. Frank from Brown has these models that sort of take inspiration from what we know about different regions of the brain that actually can perform. So all these are models that can perform tasks to one degree or another. And so the question is, like, how do we actually go about, trying to use those to understand the functional organization of the brain and what the ontology might be? And they're a really interesting sort of inspiration now is coming from work on using deep neural networks to try to understand brain computation. So I'm going to talk about a specific example, which is work that's from my colleague Dan Yeamans, along with Jim DiCarlo. A number of other groups have been doing sort of similar work, where basically, what they do, they're interested in the visual system of the primate. They work on non-human primates. And there's a lot that's known about all the regions in the kind of feed-forward cascade through the ventral visual stream from the retina through area V1 out through the temporal lobe. And DiCarlo's lab has spent 20 years recording from all these areas and really characterizing what are the features of responses in those areas. So what they did in this work, first published in 2014, was to basically take a set of images and show them to monkeys and record from a bunch of neurons across different areas in the ventral visual stream. Then they took those same images and presented them to hierarchical convolutional neural networks of the form that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And those networks have in reality, the structure of those networks was originally inspired in part by the structure of the primate visual system, in the work of people like Jan LeCun. But basically they can train a neural network to, for example, take the images from ImageNet, train it to do, say, 1,000 category image identification. And now they can, in some sense, record from the units in these different layers. And what they then do, there's no information about the brain went to the training of this model. But so what they do is they take the signal, the activity within the units in each of these regions, and ask, where in the brain, in the primate brain, are neuronal responses best predicted by that individual layer? And what they see is that there's this cascade such that early parts of the primate visual system are best predicted by early parts of the neural network. Later parts of the visual system are best predicted by later parts of the neural network. And so that provides a model to understand the visual system, right? You can actually do incredibly well at predicting, the signals, the neural responses from the signals in the artificial neural network, to the degree that you're pretty much predicting almost all of the explainable variants. And so that's a useful model, you might think, right? So the question is, like, let's say that we know that, this layer here, let's call it pool 5, is predicting the activity in primate area V4. What does that tell us about what V4 does? What's the function that's being implemented by V4? And you might say, well, it's the thing that this part of the network does. And what is the thing that part of the network does? Well, in some sense, it's defined obviously by the weights and the structure of the network. But some people have also tried to ask, can we take the way that people do neuroscience and sort of turn that on its head, and in some sense do like in silico electrophysiology on neural networks? This is a set of images from Chris Ola's work, is one of the first people to do this sort of stuff, basically showing you can look at different layers in the neural network, and you can see that, for example, the receptive fields get bigger, and that's in part just due to the structure of the way the network's built. But you can see that the representations start to change as well, right? Like early on, it's mostly like each particular unit is representing something that's a relatively simple feature. Later on, they start to represent things that are much more complex. And interestingly, in this case, even in sort of, translation or sort of, symmetry invariant sorts of ways, right? So this is a dog face pointing right, but the representation is a dog face pointing left. So I think that sort of approach is an interesting but really difficult challenge for us when we ask, what is it that we want from a cognitive ontology? We want, I think, hints at what the mechanisms are. And, psychologists like myself and a lot of cognitive neuroscientists are most comfortable putting, sort of names on those things, right? And ultimately, those names may just be sort of very cheap kind of, mental boxes to stick things in, where the real explanation is a computational explanation, right? The real language that it's written in, is like we can use the word gravity, and everybody knows what gravity is, right? But the real language in which gravity is written is math, right? If you really want to understand gravity, you have to understand the mathematical descriptions of how gravity works. So I think we have to think about, how do we bring together all these different things that we want from a cognitive ontology? We want to have some ideas about mechanism. Obviously, we need to have some construct validity. We want our measures, the constructs that we're talking about in science, to actually relate to other constructs out in the world. And then we also need to, we want them to be computationally plausible, such that we think that things like brains could compute them in ways that make sense to us. So in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that there is a need for sort of formal ontologies. And there's a number of different things we can do with them. And I think that we ultimately need to move from, using natural language terms to using computational terms, but we don't really know what the right level of computational terms are. And then there's a whole other layer here, which I haven't even touched on, which is very relevant to the things that you think about, which is, how do you also bring sort of dynamical system sort of language to bear on those explanations as well. I think most importantly, we need better proofs of concept of how these ontologies are actually going to be useful for us to convince researchers that they're worth thinking about. And that's other work that I can say a little bit more about, but didn't have time to include. Finally, just want to thank all the folks who've worked with me, including Dr. Shine here, and people who've given us money. And I'm happy to take some questions.